Welcome to the 9 South-South Forum on Sustainability. The theme is the collapse of modern civilization and the future of humanity. Since 2011, the Global University for Sustainability has organized the South-South Forum on Sustainability. We aim to bring together thinkers and actors, predominantly from the South, but also from the North, for a dialogue and exchange for two key areas of concern: alternative development and ecological sustainability, putting a focus on articulating and understanding experience on the ground, especially relatively autonomous, self-managing local units and their inter-independent networking and relations of mutuality. We recognize and value the large pool of existing efforts, resources, and convergency, and aim at adding to cross-border exchanges in the endeavor for the formation of new historical subjects for cultural and social change for another possible world. In this forum, we organized 2 panels to commemorate our senior friend, Gustavo Esteva. Today, the theme is Every I is a We, the intellectual legacy of Gustavo Esteva. We provide English, Spanish, and Chinese simultaneous interpretation. You can find a group icon of interpretation at the bottom of your computer screen. We would like to thank today's interpreters, Lola Lafrende, Mercedes Pico, Huang Xiaomei, and Li Monghong. May I first introduce myself as the co-moderator for today's session. My name is Tsui, Jade Margaret. I am Associate Professor at the Rural Revitalization Strategy Research Institute, Southwest University, China. I am board member of Asian Regional Exchange for New Alternatives, Hong Kong, China, and a founding member of Global University for Sustainability. I have been actively involved in the rural reconstruction movement in China for over 2 decades. Rafael ESCOBEDO does research at the intersection of organization theory, agrarian, and non-state societies, with a special interest in the role of peasant farmers and seasonal farmer workers, subaltern politics. He holds an MA in Sustainable International Development from the Heller School. Specifically, Rafael studies how peasant farmers and farm workers are affected and in turn purposefully influence complex systems through autonomous learning and resistant networks. Rafael is currently working as a researcher and collaborator of autonomous organizations and communities, and is the head editor of Gustavo Esteva's intellectual legacy. Now I pass the floor to Rafael. Thank you very much.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone in this very important and significant event to commemorate Gustavo Esteva's intellectual legacy. We are gonna start with the presentations of the participants. All of them had a close relation with Gustavo, and were discussing often not only his ideas, but his perspectives on how living in a different world was possible. So we will start today with the presentation of Elias Gonzalez. Elias Gonzalez is a philosopher and writer. He focuses on interreligious dialogue and the bridge between mysticism and the struggles to build a new world. He has collaborated with different interreligious groups, indigenous and spiritual communities. He's currently an adjunct professor at ITESO and Ibero León. He collaborates with the Universidad de la Tierra in Oaxaca and is a member of the Center for Studies of Religion and Society of the University of Guadalajara. He's a spiritual companion, a Zen practitioner, and creator of study and dialogue groups around mysticism. He coordinates the blog Dawn, author of the following books: Encounter, Relegation and Dialogue, Reflections Towards an Interreligious Dialogue, Impotent Tenderness, Discovering Yourself in the Small, and Conviviality and Political Resistance from Below, The Legacy of Ivan Illich in Mexico. With this introduction, I will invite Elias to present.
All right. Well, I have presented something that I'm going to read in order to facilitate interpretation. These are just some notes on radical pluralism in Gustavo Esteva. This is something that I would like to share with you today. This is a topic that is crucial in order to understand the life and work of Gustavo Esteva. Radical pluralism is transversal in the life and work of Gustavo Esteva, although the most explicit and complete formulations of this topic were configured during the last 2 decades of his life. But a brief overview of what he called the gaps or the breaks might help us better understand this approach. Gustavo came from a family of landowners that lost everything during the revolution. His mother's family, on the other hand, had indigenous origin from the Zapoteca community. On many occasions, Gustavo told how his grandmother could not be seen by his father at home. All indigenous heritage had to be denied or had to be hidden. During his education, Gustavo studied in the most outstanding schools and universities in the country. When the first department stores arrived in Mexico, Gustavo was convinced, along with everybody else, that buying what was sold in these stores was the requirement in order to achieve a good life. In spite of Gustavo's involvement with indigenous and peasant struggles, be it from his time in the guerrilla cell in the government or in civil society, he recognized himself that subtle racism in our society left his life very slowly. Racism, which is a way of not embracing radical pluralism, occurs both in explicit discrimination as well in the alleged help that is provided by well-intentioned individuals or institutions that want to help indigenous people leave their poor conditions. In other words, historically, there has been an attempt to help, to aid indigenous peoples through their de-Indianization, turning them into something that they are not. This takes place both in school and also in social programs. By the early 1980s, Gustavo already had left the government and he was working very closely with peasant and indigenous communities. He studied economy, political science, history, and anthropology to better understand where he was standing. However, the more he studied, the less he was able to understand. He says that then, just through pure chance, he met Ivan Illich at a conference that he even had no interest in participating in. This encounter with Illich opened up a new paradigm for Gustavo from which to understand different realities that he walked with the people, with the communities. As he came to say several times, Illich spoke the language of the people. And it was together with Illich that Gustavo undertook a radical critique of development. He had been at the center of it when he worked in the government, so he knew the monster firsthand. Once, Illich asked Gustavo if he had to choose a word to name what would come after development. Gustavo replied, hospitality. Development in any one of its forms is defined by assuming a good lifestyle to which one must aspire. For decades, this lifestyle has been the American way of life. And this is why development will always end up destroying the ways of life of communities, because it does not embrace the diversity of possible worlds and their mutual incommensurability. It strives to define what a good life is for once and for all. Hospitality, on the other hand, presupposes both diversity of good lives, as many good lives as people, communities, and cultures there are, but it also refers to the relationship between diversity. When I am a guest in another person's house, there are a series of rules, and hospitality goes both ways. I don't go into the bedroom of whoever invited me unless I am allowed to. They give me permission, and whoever invites me does not force me to become someone that I am not. In this way, the great topic for which Gustavo Esteva is recognized in different parts of the world, his critique of development, basically contains an intercultural point of view. Thinking of many possible worlds, Gustavo agreed with a lot of other people when he perceived that one of the great topics of the 21st century would be diversity. How can we host the other people's otherness? With this in mind, he seriously entered and discussed intercultural reflection. His many years living in indigenous and working with indigenous communities, and his relationship with Illich was the beginning. But soon he came across the work of Raymond Panikkar and one of his disciples, Robert Vachon, the founder of the Montreal Intercultural Institute. The intercultural imperative that Gustavo lived took him into a diversity of paths. In his personal life, he decided to leave Mexico City and to go live in a town in the outskirts of Oaxaca City, a few kilometers from where his Zapoteca grandmother was born. There, in Oaxaca, he founded the CEDI, the Center for Intercultural Studies and Dialogues, and later the Universidad de la Tierra, University of the Earth, Oaxaca. His involvement with Zapatismo is also aligned with his commitment to radical pluralism, which in Zapatista terms is expressed as a world where many worlds fit. He also opened himself to intercultural research, following the concept homeomorphic equivalence, trying to trace equivalence but not synonyms of certain concepts such as rights in different cultures. One of his most important research was the research that led him to realize that peace is not universal, and that among the Zapotecas, the closest thing to this would be something like what we know in the West as friendship. When we talk about radical pluralism or interculturality in Gustavo Esteva, therefore, we don't talk about the invention of an isolated genius, if this can even exist, but rather the fruit or the result of concrete encounters with real people and real communities. Radical pluralism assumes that there is no personal or collective experience that can exhaust human totality. It is defined as a relativity that is not relativism, but rather the verification that everything is related. Gustavo criticizes the notion of individual, an isolated atom, and following Panikkar, he speaks of the person as a knot of the network of relationships. Actually, even in our most intimate selves, we are made up of a plurality, a related plurality. From my point of view, the great contributions of Gustavo Esteva in relation to radical pluralism are two. One, assuming the incommensurability between diversity and radical pluralism as a political project. The first case can be understood from Gustavo's suggestion of a dialogue of living. Many people have talked about a dialogue of knowledge, intercultural dialogue, or even interreligious dialogue. And it was through this last concept that I met Gustavo, interreligious dialogue. Raymond Panecar, Boaventura de Sousa Santos, and many other names come to mind. However, in most cases, it seems that the proposed dialogue, even when it wants to bridge the gap, makes an extra effort to the mutual understanding or to reach something in common. Gustavo, in contrast, emphasizes that the dialogue of knowledge, different knowledges, has a limit, that one reaches a point where cultural, philosophical, or religious diversity will simply reach an impasse, after which there can be no possible mutual understanding. That is when he proposes the concept of dialogue of living or forms of living as a step beyond the mere dialogue of knowledge. For Gustavo, radical pluralism and intercultural dialogue can be fulfilled not when we discuss philosophically about any topic, but when we organize ourselves to do things together. This brings me finally to Gustavo's second contribution to radical pluralism. His political analysis show critically how the modern project as a nation state, as development, as capitalism, colonialism, democracy, patriarchy, etc., are all defined by their allergy to pluralism. It is worth bringing up an image presented by Illich. The world of different cultures is like a multicolor oriental rug, where the diversity of threads intertwines with each other. Modernity, on the other hand, is like when we turn one of these rugs around, and when we no longer see these multicolored threads, but a gray instead, a gray homogeneity. The modern project, therefore, operates through destroying the world's diversity by homogenizing everything on its way. This has been showed by Illich, Panecar, and others. But Gustavo goes further. He closely followed Zapatismo, and he affirmed that what people and groups from below are doing is building not a single unique new world, but a plurality of worlds. It is no longer about the proletariat of the world joining together, uniting, but about a common no that results in a plurality of different yeses from each other. According to Gustavo, different community networks are either already recovering their old ways of life or reinventing themselves as a community, sometimes from scratch. They recover life in their hands by snatching it, taking it away from the institutions. And Gustavo called this ongoing insurrection or ongoing rebellion. Ordinary people rebuild their lives amidst the civilization catastrophe, resulting in a radical pluralism that is not only postulated in philosophy books, but is lived in the day-to-day practice of thousands and thousands of people around the world. And with this, I finish for now my first intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elias. So now we will proceed with Wendy Juárez. Wendy is a Zapotec woman audiovisual creator, radio broadcaster, and photography enthusiast. She's part of the Red Futuros Indígenas in Mexico. She collaborates in the Universidad de la Tierra, taking up the critique of development and cybernetic mentality, as well as from the reflection and action in life alternatives to heal, learn, and regenerate our communities. She's a university teacher of topics related to communication theories. With that introduction, I would give the microphone to Wendy Juárez.
Muchas gracias.
Hello, everyone, and thank you. Thanks for allowing us to be part of this forum. So, just as Elias did, I am also going to read a text that I wrote in order to make everything easier. There are a lot of points that are very similar to what Elias has shared already with us. So let me start directly by talking about the legacy, the intellectual legacy of Gustavo, saying that it is a legacy of life, because his intellectual contributions were essentially life lessons. For those of us who got to know him closely, it would be difficult to name him as an author or a theorist, because Gustavo was a companion, a father, a grandfather, or a friend. Usually he said, "We are not preachers of the good news. We just share what we live ourselves, what we do ourselves, what we are." So his intellectual legacy is also a legacy of life. This legacy was built on a fabric of relations with his family, friends, and the people who met him throughout his life. The critique of development is linked to a deep reflection based off the story of Lolo, her Zapotec grandmother. Elias mentioned her as well. She couldn't enter the house in Mexico through the front door. She had to sneak in through the back door of her house. So Gustavo realized that this was the story of many Mexican families, a racial history of modern Mexico, which tried to hide its indigenous past. Another important aspect that prompted his criticism to development was that he belonged to the first generation of students who would become business managers. So he was a pioneer in the struggle to develop a country like Mexico, to escape from its indigenous past, away from the customs and the traditions that prevented progress and development. So destiny was already written, the answer was already given. But was that actually the path that Gustavo wanted to follow? I would like to move on now to a second part, which is the invention of the development. In a text, he mentioned, under development began on January the 20th, 1949. Since then, development at least implies one thing, escaping from an undignified condition called underdevelopment. Gustavo was 13 years old at that time, and he remembered that time. That day, 2 billion people became underdeveloped. He says himself, Gustavo says himself, in the text he wrote for the Dictionary of Development, edited by Wolfgang Sachs in 1992. There is another text, which I think it is still not published in Spanish, where Gustavo mentions the archaeology of development. Probably the earliest vernacular uses of the word were related to making, to writing or unfolding a scroll. It was kind of like going back to the original form of an object. So it describes a process that frees the potentialities of an object until it reaches its natural and complete form. However, the metaphorical development is expressed as growth, acceleration, progress, and this metaphor reaches its full state in a context of the post-war period. On January the 20th, 1949, when Harry Truman uses this word to inaugurate the era of American hegemony, using development as an euphemism for the American strategy to help the countries devastated by war. This help is intended to reach the group of countries that were sentenced to be underdeveloped, that is to say, who live differently from the standard imposed by the US. In addition to development, it was necessary to stop aid, Gustavo said in another text. Because in this expression of apparent goodness of aid, there is a hierarchical subtlety hidden of someone who is showing the scarcity and the needs of a certain sector, which requires a kind of help in order to reach a state of well-being or development set or established by another group, in this case by the Americans. 10 years after the invention of development, its failure was evident. In 1960, the rich countries were 20 times richer than the poor. In 1980, they were 46 times richer. So development and industrialization had succeeded to impoverish most countries and to enrich an elitist minority, convincing us that one day we would become like them if we managed to work hard enough in order to reach them, if we agreed to give up our territories and our lives for that. The third point I would like to make is the denial of the we. And I would like to make a point here, in addition to the critique to the development that Gustavo clearly shown, his meetings with one of his great friends, Ivan Illich, links this critique to institutions such as the state or education. So development imposes a unique way of living, which is valid at a global level, validated by the great hegemonic powers like the US or like Germany. And it is validated at a local level, but the nation states. In this way, the diversity of living, of knowledge is cancelled, creating a standard of living which is focused on the construction of schools, hospitals, houses, streets full of cement, whether they are useful or not for daily life. So stripping away the native ways of living, of being, of understanding the world. Ivan points out the counterproductiveness of these institutions. People no longer live in their houses, they only sleep in small apartments, so apartments that are built to spend as little time as possible there. The people no longer heal, they just medicate. The earth cannot breathe anymore, it is covered by cubes of concrete. So the priority in the industrial area is our cars. People no longer walk in the streets. The school is not a space for creativity, but a training center for obedience, for the preparation of workers that are willing to follow instructions for at least 8 hours per day. In countries such as Mexico, Canada, or the US, education was the tool used by the nation state to eliminate the cultures who had inhabited ancestrally in those territories. The institutions of modernity and development sought to annihilate cultural diversity. In Mexico, for example, my mother belonged to the generation that was prevented from speaking her original language, Zapotec. School teachers could punish children who spoke their mother tongue because the recent Mexican nation state only validated one official language, inherited from the Spanish colony. Many of the later generations were left speechless, orphans of our mother tongue. But there were several peoples that resisted this attempt of oblivion. In Oaxaca, for example, the Zapotec, Chontal, and Mareña communities, that is to say the ones that live close to the sea, they still keep a large number of speakers. Same thing happens in the Sierra Mije or Sierra Juárez, and in the Mayan culture. The Mayan culture is one of the cultures that resisted the most. So in many communities, we still keep our clothes, our traditions, rituals, and language. In addition to the punishment of official institutions, we also experience social sanctions. Most of the mestizo population of Mexico has exercised deep racism and discrimination to the native peoples. So modernity and development are tools of colonialism, are also forms of violence that operate with greater force by means of the nation state. Currently, it is the apparatus of the state, together with the owners of the capital, who impose development projects in our territories. They consider that we don't know how to benefit from the resources and that they have to show us how to do that, even if that implies destroying our territories and dispossessing us of the lands where our ancestors lived. Gustavo had seen this situation, and that's why he decided to move to Oaxaca, and he spent half of his life near the town where his grandmother was born. He didn't follow the destiny that was imposed on him by becoming a business administrator. He built his own path, and he wanted the next generations to do the same. One of the projects that he devoted the last 20 years of his life was the University of the Earth, a space that has prompted us to challenge the myth of development and to build our own path. It was a space to reaffirm our being and our doing in the world in order to regenerate ourselves in community. It is also an intercultural space where indigenous and non-indigenous people converge. We meet there to talk and to act in the face of the problems and the realities that we face. And then there is the post-development era and the community settings. In 1985, Gustavo participated in an international conference of the International Society for the Development in Rome. Since then, he affirmed that there is no way for development to be sustainable or friendly. It is impossible to talk about alternative development, he said. If there is any hope, it is in the community areas, he said, from where the alternatives to development can be created. Since then, he set out to look beyond development, leaving it in the past without bringing it to the present or to the future. So he started talking about the post-development era. At that time, in front of Mahit Ranema, Jean Robert, and Wolfgang Sachs, Ivan asked Gustavo, if you only had to choose one word to imply that you are beyond development, which word would you use? And Gustavo said, hospitality. He responded immediately. The idea of development is inhospitable. It assumes a single definition of good life and rejects all others. So being beyond development implies to open up ourselves to the many ways of living that actually exist in the real world. So in the face of development, we don't need a new invention. We just need to acknowledge our past in order to reaffirm the future that we want and in order to be able to act in the present. Post-development is not the era that follows development. Gustavo shows this, explains it, saying that it's like post-modernity, which is not the era that follows modernity, but the disillusionment of the moderns when they realize that they can no longer trust the universal truths that they believed. Alternatives are created beyond development, together with the earth, beyond individuality, becoming aware of the community that we are, beyond capitalism, in autonomy, beyond the formal democracy, in assemblies or collective organization, beyond conflict, in diversity. Hospitality implies recognizing diversity, cultivating dialogue. It is not easy to acknowledge others who are different from myself, from what I know, from what I've lived. And that's why listening and dialogue are aspects that are a priority in this hospitality relationship. Colonization evidenced the imposition of something universal, because when different cultures and worlds met, diversity was denied. One culture imposed its vision on the other. From this criticism, Gustavo also invites us to have the limits of hospitality clear, not losing sight of respect and affection to ourselves. The community areas are made possible in the urban and in the rural. in the city and in the countryside, challenging the absolute truths that modernity and development try to impose on us. Returning to the we implies acknowledging ourselves in constant relation with others. Living in community areas imply going beyond the self, living in a we, not in an I. There is no individual existence, as the Western philosophy made us believe. What Gustavo Esteva did was to honor his ancestry, to honor his Zapotec grandmother. So he built spaces of open doors, and together with his life partner, they made possible the reality of living differently, cultivating their own land and living their own way. So beyond development, this was the good life for him.
Thank you, Wendy. We will proceed now with Professor Lau Qin-Chi. She's the coordinator of the program on Cultures of Sustainability, Center for Cultural Research and Development of Lingnan University in Hong Kong. She has taught in Lingnan University for 35 years. She's also a founding member of the Global University for Sustainability and director of its executive team. She has been involved in the rural reconstruction movement in China for over 2 decades, and she's also a board member of Peace Women across the globe. With that, I'll give the microphone to Professor Qin-Chi.
Thank you, and good day, everybody. Last year at the 8th South-South Forum on Sustainability, we had Gustavo deliver opening remarks and also the inaugural lecture. At that time, we could not have imagined that we would not see him again this year. That instead of having Gustavo do a launch of his book at the 9th South-South Forum, we are here to remember him, to commemorate him, and talk about how he had left an intellectual legacy to us. The book, which would soon be published with Palgrave Macmillan under the Global University series, was a project that Gustavo and I pursued after last year's South-South Forum. We had regular monthly meetings to discuss which articles to select from his many writings and how he would be conversing with readers from China and the Global South. Our meeting to go over the full version of the book was scheduled to be February the 25th this year, but Gustavo came down with COVID and hospitalization, and he left us on March the 17th. With grief in my heart, I have sought the help of Rafael, ESCOBEDO, and David BARKIN to complete the book project. The title of the book will be Walking on the Edge of the Abyss, Conversations with Gustavo Esteva. It will come out in spring next year. There is little time today to go over Gustavo's many important intellectual legacies. Thus, I would urge you to read the book. His other collection of writings will be published by Routledge, entitled A Critique of Development and Other Essays. It will also come out next spring. Gustavo is a dear friend in whom I found many common perspectives. I have resonance with Gustavo's insistence on being rooted in the local soil of the peasant communities and to be able to see the creative worlds that they nourish. The wide variety of experiences at the grassroots go beyond so-called development and modernity. The concrete experiences of living in a community would foster a consciousness that is based on the commons of the community. Gustavo, learning from Ivan Ilyich, names his pursuit a philosophy of soil, to recover the grounding in both soil and virtue. This is where tradition would be readopted and renewed. I would like to highlight the philosophy and practice that Esteva frequently referred to about the indigenous communities. Every I is a we, Gustavo said. For the marginalized, particularly the indigenous people, a we is the first layer of their being. They are a community, not a collection of individuals, and they cannot separate the human we, family, friends, neighbors, from the non-human we of place. Gustavo explained that the word world in the Zapotec language is Lapsa Bayu, which means I and we in this place. My horizon, that is, the circle that my eyes can reach around me. The other side, what is beyond my horizon. The real world is everything within my visual horizon, my place, my we. The rest is mystery. The rendition of the term I and we into Chinese could be 我, myself, and 我们, ourselves, marked as singular and plural. Or it can be rendered as 小我, small self, and 大我, large self. However, there can be misleading connotations. The Chinese small self refers to an individual, whereas the large self refers to something larger, which can be community or nation or cosmos. However, a Chinese idiomatic expression is the small self should sacrifice for the large self to be accomplished. Thus, there is a tension between the two, referring to a hierarchy of importance for the interest of one to be subordinated to the interest of all. Of course, all thoughts need to be contextualized in their history and culture. In Gustavo's elaboration of the indigenous philosophy and practice of every I is a we, there are different layers of being. It is recognized that a person is a social being, part of a group, member of a community, sharing language, social relations, customs, and what is common produced in a shared living. The person is singularity produced in social interactions and is produced in history and culture. There is no independently existing I. All are interdependent and dynamic and susceptible to change, which is why Gustavo puts so much emphasis on hospitality, friendship, and trust, from which we can find joy and hope. This philosophy, recognizing that every I is a we, is a wise and preferred way of living together, of good living, rooted in the local soil, self-organizing, and respectful of differences. Hence, the famous phrase from the Zapatistas that it is a world in which all worlds can be embraced, where there is no separation of subject and object, and the people are collective subjects without clear boundaries or continuities, transforming the unbearable reality, constructing new worlds. I have referred to this quotation from Gustavo many times in my discussion of the Zapatista movement and have elaborated its relevance to the rural reconstruction movement in China. I highlight that the I and the we are not static entities, but changing subjectivities embedded in and constructed by fluid social relationships. As Gustavo said, we is a verb rather than a noun. The we is manifold, as there are different relationships being woven. The question in China, as in many countries, is that in the modernization and urbanization process, individualism and egoism have superseded identifications with collectives or communities. The egoistic I is presumed to be autonomous, independent, rational, and surviving on his or her own competences. This process of atomization is accompanied by a century-long process of disintegration of rural communities, as well as interdependent modes of production and livelihood. Even though society cannot operate without interdependence and cooperation, the myth of individual autonomy is propagated by modern education, as well as institutionalized economic and social modes of governance. Money becomes the god guiding human activities. The paradox is that there is increasing dependence on the system and decreasing control of individuals over their own lives. The classic discussion of the state or the market presupposes the entities in question are existing independently on their own with fixed identities, hence fails to tackle the level with regard to the conditioning of individuation, not only in material terms, but in terms of the psyche and the subjectivity. On the other hand, like Gustavo, I find the Zapatista experiment offers an alternative in theory and in praxis. It is an example of another world being made possible, and it is existing and evolving. The struggle has been arduous, with the Zapatista movement being subject to incessant violence and threat from the state, the army, the paramilitary, the mafia, etc. Yet, the path chosen by the Zapatistas to build their communities differs from many conventional struggles. In my view, what is most impressive is that they are not reactive to the external threats or emulate the regimes of the oppressors or blackmailed into subservience. Instead, they develop a strong identification with the traditions of the community. Rather than having money as the central guiding criterion, something much more powerful is at work, the embrace of dignity. Dignity has been exiled by the discourses of the colonial masters and the modern elites, but has been carefully nurtured by the Zapatistas and many indigenous communities. The self-governance of the Zapatistas is based on an intricate weaving of the social fabric, continuing with and reviving ancient traditions of not only practices, but also outlooks and values. Atomized eyes seeking individual gains give way to a system of responsibilities and reciprocities. This is the basis for local governance going for self-sufficiency, and delinking from the modernization paradigm is not only in the economic or social arena, but most importantly, in the subjectivities and collective consciousness. There is much that we can learn from the Zapatista movement and much that we can take from Gustavo's crystallization of the gems of the Zapatista and other indigenous experiences. Gustavo was very excited that his ideas and writings were being propagated in China. We had put Chinese subtitles to his speech for the 8th South-South Forum last year, and it has been viewed by over 120,000 people in China. Gustavo had looked forward to a good exchange with the Chinese audience. What we can do now is to continue to translate his works and to continue with his intellectual legacies. Let us work on our different soils, in our different localities, for hope and for conviviality, which are Gustavo's favorite terms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kinchi. We will proceed now with Professor David Barkin. Professor Barkin is a distinguished professor at the Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana, Xochimilco campus in Mexico City. He collaborated in the founding of the Eco-Development Center in 1974. He received the National Prize for Political Economy in 1979. He's a member of the Mexican Academy of Sciences and is an emeritus member of the National Research Council. He's recognized for his theory of radical ecological economics developed during the past 15 years. In 2016, he received an award from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. His latest books are From Protest to Proposal, 50 Years Imagining and Building the Future, and the Environmental Strategy in Latin America and the Caribbean. With that being said, I'll give the microphone to Professor Barkin.
Being here in a session as a tribute to Gustavo Esteva is an extraordinary honor and a responsibility. I met Gustavo Esteva 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago. We worked together and wrote a number of books together. And our interactions have been an extraordinary voyage through the world of ideas, through the world of people, and more importantly, through the world of understanding that we have to look for what Gustavo was very famous in saying, an alternative. An alternative to development, yes. An alternative to neoliberalism, yes. But also, and perhaps most importantly, an alternative for a good life. Gustavo, when I met him, was working in the Mexican government to try to improve the lot of peasants, to assure the ability of the Mexican government to make good on its promise to create more opportunities for the people who had inherited the revolution, the Mexican Revolution of 1910, and the Constitution that came out of it in 1917. Gustavo Esteva understood that and tried to turn that history into a reality that would work within the Mexican institutional system. In those years, I had the pleasure and honor of working with, collaborating with, and writing a number of what we thought at the time were important papers. I want to mention in this context a different kind of Gustavo Esteva, a different era of Gustavo Esteva's work. We wrote a book called Inflation and Democracy, which at the time was an attempt to explain in a different way what inflation was. And over the years, we have come back to that book because what we understood at that time was something that many people in other parts of the world were grappling with, but unable to free themselves from the institutional ties and the institutional strength of the International Monetary Fund. In that book, basically to synthesize it, the book Inflation and Democracy proposes that inflation is in fact the result of a class struggle, of a repressed or an open class struggle. And we're seeing it perhaps no more clearly today than we did 50 years ago, 40 years ago, when we finished writing that book. That book, surprisingly, received the National Prize in Political Economy here in Mexico. I'd say surprisingly because the jury that had to evaluate that book was actually the political class in Mexico. And when we talked to them about why and how they arrived at their decision to award the book the National Prize in Political Economy, they clearly said that what we had done in that book was show how the class conflict was such an important underlying theme of what was happening in Mexico at that time. But I would like to stress that now in 2022, the class conflict is very, very much an underlying cause of what is the global inflationary process today. At the same time, I had the pleasure, the honor, and the real opportunity to introduce Gustavo Esteva to Ivan Illich in Cuernavaca. It's interesting that in his written notes today, he recalls meeting Ivan Illich as someone he didn't know. But I had been working with Illich for 5 or 6 years when I first met Gustavo Esteva. And it was a very pleasure, and it was a great pleasure to see the meeting of the minds of two people who were from such different backgrounds coming together. But jumping ahead, and to not monopolize this conversation, we, over the years, collaborated in a whole series of efforts to try to create organizations that would bring together community groups throughout Mexico who would be involved in taking the control, holding the reins of their productive activities and trying to overcome the limitations of government policy, trying to overcome and move ahead in building a different kind of rural society. And it was in that era that I had the opportunity also to learn a little about the rural reconstruction movement in China. A very, very important element, which in a parallel way was doing what Gustavo was trying to do here in Mexico. And I think we have to celebrate and understand that the approachment, the coming together of Gustavo Esteva's work and the work of Lingnan University in our global university is very much the result of a coincidence of souls, souls in the most profound sense of the word. It would be many years later that we would meet with Kinchi Lao, and we'd be invited to become founding members of the global university. And it would be an extraordinary honor to understand the way in which the people from our global university supported the World Social Forum. And although Gustavo himself did not travel to many of these events, it was the case, a very, very important case, that Gustavo was constantly making comparisons between many of the underlying thoughts of our global university and the people in our global university with what he was doing in Mexico. His early support of the Zapatista movement cannot be underestimated. His early support of the University of the Earth, both in its campus in Chiapas, as a support, as an intellectual and a meeting ground for international groups to understand and dialogue with the Zapatista movement, and the founding of the Universidad de la Tierra, or Earth University in Oaxaca, cannot be underestimated, should not be misappreciated. I want to come back constantly. I want to come back to the importance of the views of what Gustavo Esteva was talking about, with the views of a man in China, Wendy, who is one of the founding members or the main support of the rural reconstruction movement, the new rural reconstruction movement in China, of which the people at our global university, the Chinese people in our global university, place so much importance. I want to move ahead, to jump ahead to what Gustavo was trying to do in bringing together groups from around the world to build what he often said as the alternative to development. I think that it's important to understand that the thinking and the ideas that are embedded in the books that Lau Qinchi has mentioned, the Routledge book that will be coming out this year, probably, and the Palgrave book, which is very much a part of the work of our global university, are very much an invitation to reconstruct the world. How do you reconstruct the world with such enormous powers, with such important efforts to control everything that is going on, to make sure that capital can continue to control the world? How do you reconstruct that world? The university, the Earth University, Universidad de la Tierra in Oaxaca, represents an extraordinary opportunity and example of how to bring individuals together to begin to do that in their own backyards. And that, I think, is the final lesson that Esteva offers us. People working in their own backyards, but not working individually. Building their communities, yes. Assuring their ability to feed themselves, to give themselves an adequate quality of life, yes, very, very important. Assuring that they are working to improve the quality of their territories and to take control and to resist the efforts of international capital in working to invade their territories. A new round of expansion of capitalism in many of the same ways that took place in the 14th, 15th, in the 15th and the 16th centuries of yore, in the initial stages of the most rapacious epic in the history of human society. But it's not only what the individual communities are doing, it's also the fact that the individual communities are creating extraordinary networks, international networks, alliances on a regional and a national and an international basis to create the political force that is necessary, that will be necessary to overcome the imperial powers and to overcome, and this is particularly important, to overcome the efforts of nation states everywhere around the world to limit the possibilities of individual peoples. In the discussions, in the 3 discussions that took place before I started to talk, each one of those people, 2 Mexicans and a Chinese, emphasized in their particular way, in their own way, the importance of the way in which Gustavo Esteva contributed to building ideas and to strengthening the ability of communities to work themselves, but also among themselves to build a better world. This tribute to Gustavo Esteva is just another example of the extraordinary depth of the influence that Esteva, the heritage that Esteva is leaving to the world. And when we go back and reflect in the small little compound where he lived in the highlands of Oaxaca, when we reflect on the beautiful garden and the extraordinary style of life that he enjoyed sharing with other people, but most importantly, sharing with his wife, Nicole Blanc, we understand that an alternative to development has many, many layers, has many, many facets. So Gustavo lived a different life. He created a different style. He became an extraordinary microphone for new ideas and for alliances among some of the most interesting people who are exploring alternative ways. For example, tomorrow we will hear of the way in which he participated in the weaving of the global tapestry of alternatives with people from different parts of the world. But Gustavo, moving from his individual homestead in rural Oaxaca, also created a worldwide movement, which is represented by this event we're having here. And it's a great honor then to thank you, to thank our global university, to thank the organizers of the South-South Forum for this opportunity to underline how extraordinarily important it is to have an event like this kind and to emphasize the importance that all the people in all parts of the world are having in making these alliances, and which will necessarily, we hope, contribute to creating these alternatives which will help a small part of humanity overcome the crises that capitalism is imposing on us. I thank you very, very much to the organizers, to Jade Margaret, to Kinchi Lau, to the translators, to this extraordinary opportunity to celebrate a man who has changed all of our lives. Thank you very, very much.
We have friends. Edwin John would like to speak. So could you introduce yourself first before you speak?
I am Edwin John from India, author of the book, Hello Neighborocracy. And neighborocracy, we promote it as a way of making a dialogue of life, action, and collaboration possible at the base by creating alternative structures for political participation and inclusion. And then we found along the process that as long as we have this system of democracy where the majority, is decisive, majority wins and the minority suffers, this kind of divisive thing, the decisions will always be in favor of the most advantaged, the rich, the powerful. So we wanted to have an alternative political system. And there we said, another factor we said, the bigger a forum becomes a decision-making forum, which we call a parliament becomes, the more it becomes the game of the bigger voices. That means as the forum becomes bigger and bigger, you need bigger and bigger voice to get across. And then here in our in the place where I'm living, in the southernmost tip of India, we have a district which is called Parliamentary Constituency, where we hold elections once in 5 years. It has some 100,000 people. That many people from one forum to elect a candidate. And in such a big forum, who alone can talk? Normally, people with big mouth, that means big mouth in terms of money. The more money you have, the more possibility you have to tell such a vast number of people that you exist, you have a face and you have a message, and that message is better than others' message. So vote for me like that. So only the rich people can do. So at the end, what happens? We get a government consisting of the rich people, all the elected people, all rich people coming together. They make a decision, and those decisions will be for the benefit of the rich and the haves rather than of the have-nots. So how do we ensure that when people come together at the base, their voice has really content weight, a decision-making power? And for that we said, why not we start neighborhood-based, territorially inclusive, small-sized forums, about 30 families each, a circle where everybody can sit around in one circle and talk without a microphone. And they become a government at that level, neighborhood level. And then they elect the next level, next level, next level, next level, next level. Like this, multi-tier federation, in such a way that anytime you are not happy with the candidate, you can always call back. Like so, any day the people at the base remain in control. So this kind of structural provision for ongoing dialogue of life and action by people, life, love, and action. For this, we create a kind of structural provision through kind of an alternative political system. And then we have been promoting this concept. And since I was promoting it, when I saw your the announcement regarding your program, I got very much interested. I said, we have something here in common. I must meet these people and I must interact with them, learn from them, like that. So this is the process we have. We are creating it as a kind of an international movement. And then as a part of this, we have what we call inclusive neighborhood parliaments of children. That when children get organized at the base as neighborhood parliaments and neighborhood governments, and they elect the next level, next level, next level. Like this, we have a provisional world parliament of children. We call it provisional because not every place is represented yet. Only when every place is represented becomes real thing. And then we also promote the concept through this structure that will small-sized neighborhoods, they get linked at every level through small-sized forums at every level. And then with the ability to recall, and this kind, through this kind of a structure, we said we could have a kind of an alternative economic system, a marketing system, a kind of marketing from below, business from below, economics from below. And that way we said people could organize and their own buying and selling, their own productions through such systems. And we found without such support of such infrastructure and systems, people will find it very difficult to for their self-organizing, for their contribution to the community, to the growth of the people. So I stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Edwin. And I would like to invite Victor Kihon. Yeah, do you like to speak, Victor, from Ecuador?
First of all, I would like to say hello to all the comrades that have participated, speaking about the thought of Gustavo Esteva, who has contributed significantly in the search for an alternative to development that is not post-development within capitalist system or another, but an alternative that can draw from a dialogue of different knowledges, but also a dialogue of different ways of living, the dialogue of a full, dignified life in the way that we mention it here in Andean countries, where we are also part of the indigenous cultures that persist and that survive, the Quechua, Aymara communities from the south of Venezuela up to Chile. So we are thrilled to share these ideas about good living, sumak causai, here as we say it in Ecuador, here in the Quechua language, which is a thought of equity, interculturality, especially in what has to do with preserving the customs and ways of life, but also in relation to co-participation in modern society through the preservation of everything, of their ways of government and their ways of education. In this moment, after 18 days of indigenous organizations mobilizations in Ecuador, we are participating in a dialogue with the different government ministries in order to establish full fulfillment of collective rights in the way that the indigenous and social movements have been able to establish in the Ecuadorian constitution in 2008, where it was established in the constitution that the Ecuadorian society was intercultural, not multicultural. And this is very important to highlight. Multi means several, but intercultural establishes exchange, establishes respect of each other. It is the consideration of difference, not as conflict, but as a way of approaching each other. It speaks about transversality, and we shared some of Gustavo Esteva's ideas in the sense of being present for another type of development, not the one that is being presented. And we established in our constitution principles such as plurinationality. Ecuador is recognized as a plurinational state, which draws from the indigenous idea of not considering oneself a nation, but several collective indigenous nations at the same time that share the idea of a better life. And that does not necessarily entail the idea of exploitation of the other, but respect of ways of life, of ways of producing in rural areas. It is very important to highlight that in Latin America, there are several participations of the indigenous people that have not been valued enough, both in history and education. Over the last decades only, this has become more prevalent because of the political activity of indigenous peoples themselves. They have moved from a demand for access to education, to healthcare, and they have moved into practicing their own ways of education and their own ways of practicing healthcare. And this, from Ecuador, which is where from I am speaking, as a participant of the Committee for the Human Rights Foundation, which is an NGO that has been linked to the indigenous movement for a long time. To me, it is very important to underline that the fact that the indigenous mobilization is not only focused on claiming and demanding rights, but also demanding for political participation, to intervene in electoral processes in order to access public roles of public participation, in order to destroy different capitalist or modify different capitalist measures. This is, from here, I want to salute all of the different presenters who mentioned their proposals, which coincide with many of the proposals that we have here in the indigenous movement in Ecuador and also in Peru and also in Bolivia, where much has been done, particularly with the government of Evo Morales. What can be done by indigenous peoples in the management of the modern state? So from this point of view, we always salute the participation of women leaders, indigenous women leaders, like Dolores Lacuango and other women, for example, here in Ecuador, who survived repression of governments, who survived violence. They were imprisoned because they spoke out. And to me, it is a pleasure to bring you the thought of Tránsito Maguaña after she was repressed and she was imprisoned when she mobilized in the 1940s and 1950s, when she formed the Ecuadorian Federation, Indigenous Federation, which was inspired by the Communist Party at that moment. And Tránsito, this indigenous leader, she said, and with this I will finish, that facing repression, she said, we are like the weed which is chopped off and it grows back. And from the weed, we will harvest in the world. Thank you very much.
And I would like to invite Professor Mohanty. Would you like to speak?
Well, it's a great honor to pay tribute to Gustavo. And, you know, I have two ideas which I have internalized from this tradition. Gustavo and our Rajni Kothari and many other alternative theorists around the world, including Wendy and David Barkin, our panelists, and you people, I mean, this whole group. One is that another meaning of development. You know, this, I had a difficulty in saying that we reject development and therefore we are for something other than development. In fact, I have used the word transformation very often. So the post-development as a term came into being. But when I translate it into any Indian language, in India, in Hindi and in my own language, Odia, it is Vikas. In Chinese, Fachan. Woman Puya Fachan, Pukanang Socheya. So development cannot be handed over to the capitalist modernizers as their monopoly of meaning, with their monopoly of meaning. This is one idea which in dialogue and learning from the Gustavo tradition, the Theotonio tradition, and I would say now the global university tradition, we learn. The second is the title of today's discussion. Every I is we. I have been fascinated by the term Ubuntu and the term Swa in Swaraj, which means self-rule, self-government, etc. But for me, it means self-realization. And self-Swa is exactly this. It did not accept the self and other distinction. It only saw the whole world as selves. And exactly, the collective and the individual, there is no distinction between that. There is no question of subordination of one to the other, and no appropriation to be allowed by either of the other. Appropriation, that is, state demanding, or the party demanding individual's loyalty and a small group's loyalty. No, they are one. Everyone is so, and this is the theme of the Ecuador, Peru, the new ideas that they are developing in their constitution and politics, and Gustavo, and the global university philosophy, and also the Ubuntu philosophy. Therefore, I would pay my tribute to Gustavo Ernesto by re-emphasizing that these ideas we shall pursue through our movements, through our writings, and through our work together for the transformation of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mohanty. And we have two Chinese questions for Wendy and Elias. The question one, I will speak in Chinese. 第一条问题，Gustavo 曾经说过
Gustavo once said that having hope does not mean that it's some determination for something will definitely happen in the future, but instead it's for believing that something is meaningful despite the failure. But the reality is cruel. We're facing an economic downturn, serious unemployment, and ongoing pandemics. How can you keep having hope? So this one's for Wendy. And question number 2 is for Elias. In a condition where the fluid, the liquid part of the population take up the majority, a long-term person-to-person interpersonal relationship, time for this are on the decrease. So it's hard to form this kind of
Could Wendy
unity among people.
The first question.
So how can we stabilize communities in this way?
Sure, thank you very much. Well, Gustavo usually mentioned a phrase from Rafael, and he did this when he referred to hope in opposition to optimism. Because, and this quote says, and I can put this in the chat box, says hope is not the same as optimism. It is not the conviction that something is going to turn out correctly, but that something makes sense and is meaningful in spite of what the turnout is or what the result is. Gustavo mentioned this phrase precisely in reference to the fact that many times you make plans at a certain moment in your life. For example, now that David Barkin mentioned when Gustavo was a government official, he was also in a planning department, and that made him learn that plans never turn out as you plan them. So the idea is to grab on to hope, not because we have a plan that we will for sure reach. And of course, this is the underlying idea of development, right? We have a point that is our objective, our aim, where we need to reach. But what we do have is a horizon that gives sense, it gives meaning to what we do. And as you mentioned before, we might fail in that journey. We might go wrong and falter on that path, but towards that horizon, if we construct it from experience that we generate through that path that we choose, that we live, that hope can be maintained and we can keep up with it. I would say, I don't know, when I spoke to him, my position was sometimes I despaired sometimes in many ways, and he didn't try to cheer me up. He didn't try to make me optimistic, but rather he told me to search for meaning in my present actions. For example, now when we talk about the climate and civilization catastrophe in which we are living right now, Gustavo didn't think that there was any optimistic way of overcoming this collapse. What he searched for actually was a hopeful way in which what we did in the present could make sense, not looking into a future that will never arrive or a future that we don't know if we're going to be able to reach at some point, but rather that present actions could have meaning and be meaningful. I also think about this in terms of the territorial defense in our different communities. I believe that a lot of what we do currently in relation to community regeneration, we are not optimistic in knowing that the overview is going to change. It's not going to change too much, probably, but we know that the defense and the care for the territory that we are currently doing is going to be meaningful for future generations and for generations that are also living in the present. So I believe that a lot of the hope that Gustavo sowed and cultivated has to do with the here and the now, and it has to do with friendship and care as political categories. We also referred to Ivan Illich when they coincided that friendship could be the engine for change of civilization and climate collapse, because something that he took and drove from Illich was that the result of the society in which we live in is going to be very good, because it's going to be the result of these very good friendships that we are cultivating. These social transformations will have their seed and will take a life of their own through care and through the pleasure taken in these and the happiness taken in these friendships, building together, not as an obligation or as an aim or as a purpose, but in this administrative scheme of planning, but through something that is as simple as friendship and the love in relation to friendship, maintaining friendship as a political category. I'm not sure if I responded to the question.
Elias, please respond to the question 1. The question 2, yeah.
Sí, muchas gracias.
Okay, thank you. I think actually that both questions are very much connected. And I think that what I was planning to answer is already related to what Wendy said. If I understood the question correctly, it's a question of how to make, within such an individual world where there is an exacerbation of the individual, how to be able to meet the diversity or these intercultural encounters that might be more real. Thinking out loud, thinking of the words of Gustavo, not having an answer myself, I would say that the question applies. It does apply because the question focuses on how to stop being so individualist. Not only individualists per se, because it seems to be that individualism is bad, is wrong, because it's an exaggeration, when actually Gustavo didn't talk so much about individualism, but individual, like being an individual in itself. He said that that's a problem already. So how can we stop being individuals? Gustavo devoted a lot of time and a lot of effort to try to deconstruct that he said, to stop being an individual. And so I think that that should be the first question, or the starting point, let's say. And from then on, because you know that that's well, what we were going to focus on today, becoming a we again. But in order to reach that, there are different paths that are related to our heritage, to our own history. There are some people that might still have, in their personal histories, in their community histories, this we. That is to say, they are people, maybe there are people who left their communities to go to the city and to study there. And maybe their grandparents still work the land, still live in the same community. So those people still remember. They still remember something that is close to them in their heritage, in their families. Some of them go back to their peoples, but even if they don't, it's in their bodies, it's in their flesh. Some other people, myself included, we are further away from that because for several generations, we've already been formatted as individuals. And I'm not talking about the first or second generation. I might be talking about, well, we might not even remember where we are coming from. So for those people who have this experience of being very, very much individuals that have been individuals for a longer time, the key is what Wendy was saying, friendship. friendship for Gustavo was the key to create new community fabrics, that is to say, weaving a fabric together between those who do not have so much of a community heritage, those of us who are further away, I don't know, for many generations have been individualized. So friendship is also the key, not to mistake the concept of community with massification or collectivism, which is another, let's say, another aspect or another facet of individualism. During last century and even in the current times, there are a lot of collective efforts, but which actually get together because they have a common political goal, or because they are from the same political party, or things like that. But very frequently, that becomes a massification, and all kinds of massification. All massification is a lot of individuals coming together. It's not the real we. The real we is built either by the territory itself, that is to say, a shared land, which is something material, something physical, or by a territory, an emotional territory, if I can say that, which is friendship and love. And that's not necessarily built because we are part of the same political party, or because we have the same political goals, or because we are citizens of the same country. Friendship is built because of spontaneity, because of gratitude, because of, I mean, it's always based on creating true, real, honest relations. Currently, the social media make us believe that we have 3,000 friends. It's impossible that you can actually cultivate and nurture so many relationships. Friendship always happens through something concrete, what your bodies can nurture or cultivate. I can have some, I cannot have thousands of friendship. It's physically impossible. So friendship is actually a call to recover the sense of the body, the sense of proportion, and that does away with all those paradigms, as Victor was saying before, of multiculturalism. For example, projects that include diversity, but from the state, or respecting diversity, but from a law, or from a legislation, or from a, I don't know, a municipal or a state obligation. You cannot build intercultural friendships from the state. You can only build them from proportional relationships between one body and another body that nurture a true bond between them. That's it. I don't want to expand or to talk too much, but that's what I've learned from Gustavo. This idea of being able to relate to one another and create bonds starts by doing things together. And doing things together implies, I mean, it's the limits of the body, you know, the real limits of the body. You know that I participate a lot in these kind of movements when we say no to the kumbaya interculturality, like, hey, we're all brothers and sisters, we all love one another. No, we love those that we really love from our bodies and that we can relate to. That's it. That's all I would like to say. And that's hope. That's where hope lies.
Thank you. And we have also friends from Japan. Takashi-san, could you like to speak now?
Thank you very much. I have posted my question. I hope I'm not too off. I myself struggle between I and we, and in Mexico, I still remember this horrific incident done by the cartels to this drug fighting mayor. Her name, I believe, is Maria Santos Gorostieta. And I'm wondering how Gustavo has been looking at these cartel activities, which is always trying to kill the people who are courageous enough to stand up for the we. And always there's the other we, which is the cartels, the politicians, that are actually not supporting these brave leaders. If anyone can have any insights on how Gustavo or people who are following Gustavo's legacy, how they would have seen or how they see the cartel activities versus these fighting leaders. Thank you.
Victor, you always raise your hand. You have some questions?
I would like some of our comrades, Wendy, Elias, David, if you could expand on the concept of we, because over here in the Andean mountain range, we understand that as the life in our territories, that is to say our bodies, this notion of person that goes together with the idea of the motherland that in Quechua is called Pachamama. So if I think of myself and I think of the we, it's not only the relation between one person and another, but also the relation with nature that is part of me as well. And currently it is a very important challenge that goes beyond the political activity of defending the land, facing extractivism, facing the looting, the extractivism and the destruction of nature to get oil and minerals. Nature was destructed during capitalism, and we talk about natural resources, but for indigenous peoples talking about natural resources, I mean, that implies myself as well. I am someone that could be exploited by capitalism. I would be part of nature as well. So I would like to know if Elias, Wendy, or David, if you know how to transcend, how to go beyond this thought that is very much individual in order to share these ideas, we part of the land, part of Pachamama, part of Mother Earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. Questions, and David, yeah, I think you would like to respond, right?
It's a very, very good question, Victor. The concept of buen vivir or sumak kausai, which is the Andean expression and that you mentioned as being part of the change that took place in Ecuador in 2008, is very much alive here in Mexico, especially in the state of Oaxaca, with a Mexican concept which is very similar. It's called comunalidad. And in that respect, I would like to also join with the doubt or the challenge that Takeshi offered us a few minutes ago. The we, comunalidad, is very much a part of the issues, of the questions that are involved in how do we go about organizing our daily life. This to me was the challenge that as individuals, as communities, as Universidad de la Tierra or Earth University posed to us. How do we go about organizing ourselves to ensure our well-being, to ensure the well-being of the future generations? And one of the things about comunalidad that is particularly important is that it involves a recuperation, a rescuing, if you wish, a restoring of the past also, of an emphasis on the extraordinary heritage that we have from past generations and that has been systematically are attacked by the Enlightenment, by the North Atlantic view of what civilization is. What we're talking about, Victor, what you're talking about, are civilizations that existed way before the Europeans, or even the Greek and Roman civilization. And we have an extraordinary background. We have an extraordinary wealth of knowledge and an assurance that by collaborating, we can try to overcome the frailties of individuals. And that, at this particular moment, I think, is the particular challenge that we make. Takeshi, I live in Michoacan, where you mentioned the problem of criminality. We can't overcome that in a country in which the criminals are offering more well-being, although one of the real challenges, one of the real problems is that this criminality is based upon a view that life is very short, that I must live as comfortably or as luxuriously as possible in my very short life, because I'm going to be killed in the very near future. And the communities within which I'm working, collaborating, the communities that Gustavo spoke to have a different view of what's going on. I would like to give an example of that in Michoacan mismo itself. I live in Michoacan, and I have been participating in the work of one of the indigenous communities, a Purépecha community called Cheran, that 11 years ago in 2011, April 15th, 2011, the women and young people of the community went into the roads leading to their forests to stop the drug people and the timber and the loggers, the illegal loggers, from continuing to destroy their lands. Now, the interesting thing about that was they were successful. A group of women, a group of young people, and we're talking about 45 people, stood in the road and stopped the trucks. And the drivers and the timbermen, they ran. And 11 years later, that community has recuperated its native language. It is reinventing its heritage, its history. But more importantly, and this was an element I wanted to stress in my earlier talk, more importantly, it has created a network of 129 other communities in the region that are beginning to understand and organize against the state efforts of discriminating and isolating them. We have a different word for that here in Michoacan than the comunalidad, but I will stick with comunalidad. In Chiapas, there is other words for sumac causai. One of the extraordinary things, Professor Mohanty, I so enjoyed my short stays with Professor Mohanty in Delhi. He mentioned the heritage of Gandhi. Fabulous. Swarak, right? Am I getting it right? And he also mentioned, I believe we've heard today in this talk, Ubuntu. What we have to understand is that all over the world, there are communities with these different views, with these different expressions, these different forms of saying the same thing. We, not I.
Exactly.
But not now, not now. We're talking about the past building the future. And it's this transformational, intertemporal connection that involves alliances among ourselves that is so very, very important. I am inspired by what is going on in this community called Cherán here at only 100 kilometers from where I live. They made me the honor last April of inviting me to talk at their ceremony, at their 11th anniversary ceremony for the taking control of their community. But the most important thing about it is, that they're not staying alone. They are bringing in, incorporating the other communities that have been subject to the same kind of problems. No, we cannot at one fell swoop attack the criminality. Mexico is suffering from a terrible problem of homicides and especially now feminicides. We're also suffering from a very confusing period in our time in Mexico today that Gustavo Esteva was very, very much concerned about. And that is, how do we manage the contradiction between local autonomy, defensive territory, and the apparently inexorable expansion of capitalism? I, frankly, with my Marxist training, my background, and the work that I did with 5 years of collaboration in Cuernavaca with Illich, I'm optimistic that capitalism will come crashing down in some ways. It will create its own contradiction. It is creating its own contradictions. And it is creating poverty and great suffering. And right now we're seeing in terms of stupid wars. But what I see, and tomorrow we'll talk about the global tapestry of alternatives, but I also see it in another organization that I live with, that I work with for 25 years, called Territories of Life, a group that is in 80 countries of communities that occupy 1/4 of the world's land area, indigenous communities from the global south. So I would, if there's a message I have for this, for the heritage of Gustavo Esteva and the extraordinary role that he played in our global university, I would say we have all the future on our side. And we are learning how to bring together the social and political forces that have behind them the spirit, the extraordinary spirit, and the understanding that humanity is not separate from nature. Humanity and nature are one interacting, humanity is just one creature in nature's panoply of extraordinary generosity. How can we create the space so that nature is not destroyed by capitalism? That's the challenge that we have. I'm sorry I spoke so long, Jade.
Yeah.
Margaret, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. And we now have the last one of let the panels to give their response. So I would like to invite Wendy and Elias and Kinchi and also David. Yeah, so your last response. Wendy?
Gracias, pues también.
Thank you. I would just like to draw from some of the things that were mentioned in these last participations and some of the questions. I would take the question about differentiating these groups, the narco trafficking groups that Elias also already gave some elements for the answer. He mentioned these groups of people, of individuals that are the masses. About 3 years ago, we held a dialogue about masses, and one of the differences that we also found there is that these groups, these mass groups, or these groups that could be the cartels, usually what joins them together is a very superficial link. This is a link that has to do more with convenience or with certain interests. Thinking about some cartels, some families, but others also kill each other within a family. So there is nothing there as related to care and love as a political category. Not even the family ties or bonds are enough. They kill each other even within a family. They're also moved maybe by certain interests, like winning over certain territories, earning more money through the sale of drugs. Of course, their objectives change because traffic is not only about drug trafficking, it's also about people trafficking in persons. So this is a very complex situation. And so, but ultimately the link that binds them has to do with interests and with certain convenience, in contrast to us. I was thinking about the question, and I believe that in the us, as was mentioned by Elias as well, there may be some cases where the we is a given. A person who is born in a community does not choose. How can I say this? That person does not necessarily choose. It's not an election. It's not a choice. I'm sorry, to be Zapoteca or to be part of a community. You are born there, your family was born there, or you were brought up there. This is a given. And other times, which is also something that Gustavo worked on throughout his life, sometimes this us is constructed. It is a friendship that is constructed through love and through a relationship with others, built through love as well. And in this relationship, what joins us together, what binds us, is something very, very deep, very deep. And there might be differences, there might be arguments, but if we have love, in spite of these discussions, arguments, angers that might come up, it is possible to continue being an us, because the relationship stems from this depth. Kimchi also mentioned in her presentation how many times the we overcomes the I, or the idea of I or self, because oftentimes we prioritize this idea of knowing that we are a we beyond my personal individual interests. To give you an example, so as to illustrate this better, in Oaxaca, many communities have a normative or regulated internal system that has to do with customs, like customary law. So it is important to take on community roles, like being a community police, or being in charge of the church, and also being an authority. But this is a scale of community services, but that service is not paid. There's no salary, and you have to take on these roles for a year, usually. And it is a community service, a service that is given to the community that sometimes entails overcoming the personal, individual interests. There are people who have had to ask for certain permission or leaves in their work, in their jobs. There are people who have received a scholarship to go study abroad, and they have had to postpone these commitments because they have to give back to the community through taking on these services. And so understanding that we are a we entails going beyond individual interest. It entails going beyond the I or the self, because what we are doing in this we, in this community, has to do with building something that goes beyond this moment or goes beyond this person that I am now. And it has to do with this body that comes together as precisely as an us. It does not have to do with this idea of sacrifice necessarily, but it is more an idea of overcoming the individualized thought and thinking and assuming the us. There is something that Gustavo usually mentioned, and it has to do with the CNI. The CNI is, I think it's the Indigenous Congress. We are an assembly when we are together, and we are a network when we are separate. This is this idea that we can be together when we are taking part of an assembly, but they not necessarily have to be together all the time. When they are physically apart or when we are spaced out, there is the link that joins us together is still active. So we are a network. We are yes, a network. So in order to give the floor to other participants, I just want to mention something that Victor said in relation to the we, and where we not only take into account the people, but also nature. Tomorrow, some comrades are going to speak about the alternatives, global alternatives network, which also involves people from India and from other parts of Latin America, Colombia and Mexico. These alternatives from Colombia and Mexico are woven in something that we have mentioned, or we have dubbed mutual upbringing or mutual rearing. And this is something that Escobar and Esteva saw when they started to get to know this indigenous idea of collective upbringing. And they saw different communities, different collectives that that presented different alternatives. And so they coined this, they drew from this Aymara concept of collective upbringing. We not only collectively raise the children, but we also raise them because we mutually grow with them when we learn how to harvest and sow milpa when we are in the forests. So this goes beyond the human or what is human, and it refers to how we raise each other and we have a collective upbringing also in relation to nature. And this can be in the physical realm, but also spiritual realm. Here we have the notions of like the lord of the forest or the owner of the mountain. And if this entity does not have physical appearance, it is a spirit that we have to ask permission to when we go into the forest or when we go up the mountain. So I also wanted to present this notion, this idea of mutual collective upbringing that I'm sure we will go back to tomorrow in the second panel.
Okay, thank you. And Elias?
Take two things that we have mentioned here today. I thought they were very interesting. The first one also has to do with Victor's comment about the role of the earth, of Pachamama in this us. I think Wendy responded to this already. David also responded to this with his mention of communality, where for sure the land in relation to this mutual upbringing plays the crucial role in this us, in this usness. We can say something like that, the concept of usness, where there is a mutual upbringing and raising of the different beings on the earth. We have mentioned this quite a lot. In order for there to be a real us, there has to be a territory. But this is clear and this is transparent when we are talking about communities and people and peoples. But what happens with processes of deterritorialization and processes of systematic loss, not only of territory, but also of the relationship with the land and the earth? So I would say two things linked to this. One, for those who have been systematically formatted as individuals, at some point, in some moment, part of ceasing to be individuals has to go through territorialization, or has to do with territorialization. And for this, it has to do with getting our hands dirty and cultivating the land and recovering this spiritual land with Mother Earth. I do not think, however, that the path to reach this is identical for everybody. I think that there are people who first will need to go through other paths. Some of them may be more humanist. The first us that these people might find has to do with maybe humans and friends, people, flesh and blood people, and maybe at another point further down the line they might recover directly their relationship with the land. Other groups, for example, might start working on the we directly, going back to the land. I believe that there are many groups nowadays where this is the first step that they are taking, going back to the land, going back to cultivate their own food and work on the food sovereignty and autonomy. But I don't believe that all groups start at this point. And we have seen this. I believe that there are many collectives that start, for example, the mothers of the disappeared, in order to connect also with the topic of violence in Mexico. There are different groups that are looking for the disappeared. And these groups, first, they establish relationships through pain, through their sorrow, and through their demand for justice, where they construct an us more on the level of human relations and ethical relations. And then later, in many cases that I have witnessed, when they are in the territory looking for the bodies, looking for the disappeared, this is translated into a territorial work. But first, of course, it stems from shared pain and shared grief, not necessarily to a link with the territory and going back to the land, but of the grief itself, of the shared pain. We are missing someone and we need to find these people. So I think that I'm persuaded that building the us and the we right now, and that sooner or later, in order for that to be complete, and in order not to remain in a simple humanism, but in authentic radical pluralism, and I spoke of this radical pluralism both in Esteba and in Panica, is cosmotheandric, and this is a complicated word, cosmotheandric. In Panica, this concept refers to humanity, world, nature, and what is divine, what is transcendental or spiritual, however we want to call it. All these elements, all these things and levels are interrelated and they are interdependent. They are interdependent, they say. We cannot speak about the divine without the human aspects, without nature, and we cannot speak about what is natural without the spiritual background and the human background. And to speak about human without the spiritual dimension and without nature is what the West has done for so long. So I believe that radical pluralism, in order for it to be radical and not mere interculturality, has to be what Gustavo also has mentioned, but I do not feel that there is only one path to achieve this, because if not, we would be going back to the idea that there is only one way. And I've seen groups like this. But there are some groups that start working on food sovereignty and the earth and the land. Others start from the grief, shared grief. Others get together for spiritual reasons, and sooner or later they will reach the territorial aspect. I believe that sooner or later we do achieve this reconnection with the land, and we do reach this point of reconnection. Finally, I want to mention something that was very interesting, because particularly I am a Zen practitioner. I think it was very interesting what Kimchi mentioned in relation to the death of the small I, so that the large I, or the I with a capital letter, which is the we, can overcome. And I believe that this is present in many traditions. The death of the small I, which I understand that is something very much pertaining to China, and that I know through the Zen and Zen Buddhism, I believe that is present in many traditions as well. The death of this small I, because, and Wendy mentioned this in a way, it doesn't have to do with the sacrifice, but it is something that we have to disintegrate on the inside. We have to disintegrate it. Gustavo mentions the patriarch that we all have inside, the fascist that we all have inside. There is something that must be transformed there in order to achieve the idea of a we and the us, because there are maybe many efforts to build a we and an us, but it's just a sum of individuals. It's a sum of individuals that want to get together, but there is no work done to de-individualize themselves. And so I believe that this little I must die, as Kimchi says. It is very important, this death of the little I. Of course, this means different things in different places, but I feel that it is very important to underline this that Kimchi mentioned. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And David?
I'm going to take you, Margaret, at your word. You sent us a message last night saying that we could take a little more time than perhaps even up to 3 hours. So I want to take advantage of something that Wendy said a few minutes ago and introduce to the audience. I'm sharing the screen here. The concept of the Milpa. Wendy, you mentioned the Milpa. And I want to present to our audience the extraordinary importance of the Milpa. The Milpa was invented 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. And it is exactly an image in nature that the Mesoamerican people created on their own, without science and technology institutes, without universities. They invented what we know in the world today as maize. Maize or maize did not exist in nature. And yet today it is one of the most important crops in the world. And yet the Mesoamerican people understood that if they were going to live, they had to improve the ability of the extraordinary powers of nature. And what has developed over the past thousands of years, and let me emphasize, I'm talking perhaps 8,000 or 10,000 years ago, is the Milpa Mexicana, the Milpa Mesoamericana, which involves the interspersing, the interseeding, the production, the joint production of maize with beans, with squash, with chiles, and all sorts of other products that are mutually supporting of each other. Let me explain. The corn, the maize, depends in large part for its health on the fact that beans are interseeded with it. And the beans provide nitrogen to the soil, which fertilize the corn stalks, the maize stalks. The squash plant has very, very large leaves, which protect the soil from drying out. And they also, extraordinarily, also produce flowers, which we use in our tortillas as a wonderful treat. And of course, the chiles. I won't continue with it, but the important thing about this is that what you see above ground here in the picture I have on your screen is only part of the interaction of these plants, because the most important thing about it, or perhaps not the most important, but an important element of it, is the way in which the network of underground roots, rhizomes, are connected to each other in a way that allows people, the plants, to feed upon and develop with each other. I hope that this is a natural example of exactly what we are talking about. It's what Victor talked about when he talked about sumak kausai, or buen vivir, or good living. It's what Professor Mohanty, I'm sorry, Professor, I can't, Manor, I can't pronounce your first name. It's what
Fine.
it's what Takeshi was questioning when he asked about the problems of the violence in Michoacan and the death of this woman mayor. But it's what Wendy was talking about with the Milpa. And I'm very, very pleased to be here, Margaret, in this session. I'm very, very pleased to have to do with the helping of putting together this extraordinary book that Lingnan has negotiated with Palgrave and our global university. I'm very, very pleased to see the disciples of Gustavo Esteva. Elias, a young man who brings his own background of interest in Zen, but also clearly learning from, and having a lot to learn from, the teachings of Gustavo. And Wendy, that wonderful woman from the highlands of Oaxaca. You have a great picture on your screen, Wendy. And Rafael, who is coming back from a refuge in the United States. I'm very, very pleased that we can make this tribute, that we can do this bringing together of the thinking, which is an example of an intergenerational growth that is very, 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 very important for us. And so in closing, what I would like to say, I would like to remind us once again that the roots of Gustavo Esteva's life in Oaxaca were in a small town some 8 or 10 kilometers from the center of Oaxaca City, in a rural community in which he built a different kind of world, a world in which the doors were open to everyone, in which there were constant conversations, and which was made beautiful, extraordinarily beautiful, by his compañera, lifelong compañera Nicole Blanc, who today is still maintaining the vitality of the gardens, the vitality of the heritage that Gustavo is leaving, and who is assuring us that the University of the Earth University, Universidad de la Tierra, will be able to continue having an extraordinary impact, a very, very important impact in the life, not only of the people who are associated with it today, but perhaps of all of Mexico and our global university. Thank you very much, Margaret. Thank you very much, Kinchi, for organizing this event. Thank you very much for allowing me all these years of being a member of our global university, because it is an incarnation of the relationship of a half a century of life that I enjoyed with my compadre, Gustavo Esteva.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much, David. And Kinchi, please.
Well, I would first like to thank the co-speakers today. It has been a very rich exchange, and I've heard of your names, Wendy and Elias, but I have not met with you before. I hope one day we can physically meet and also nurture our friendships. So I would first like to respond to what Professor Mohanty said about development. I think the word development, of course, it has still carries a very positive connotation in places, especially particularly in places that are marked as underdeveloped. And the word development has been so much bound with the word progress that it is indeed difficult for us to critique this and also to pose an alternative. But that is precisely what Gustavo has been doing for many, many years of his life, because he personally saw the effects of so-called development on the majority of population in the world, not only in the global south, but also in the so-called northern countries. So if today, if we look at the development, we can see that it is the collapse of modern civilization. That is why we put the theme of this forum to be talking about the collapse of modern civilization, which is supposed to be the golden age of development. And so if we look today to see what has become of the developed world, of the developing world, of the underdeveloped world, we see disasters and catastrophes. If we look at the melting of the glaciers in the Arctic and the Antarctic, which is indeed very alarming. If we look at the kind of injustices and poverty in the world, the ways the majority of population cannot even sustain their livelihood, then I think we have to put the whole question about development into, we have to query what the so-called development and progress has brought us. So if there is all this criminality related to the so-called development in modernity, then this criminality, can we still say there could be alternative development or sustainable development? Can we put the name compassionate criminality or alternative criminality and use it as a positive word? So it is in this kind of context that I would say we would reject a development in the same way as Gustavo has done. He said there cannot be any development of justice and of progress. And so we cannot talk about alternative development. We have to talk about alternatives to development. So So I understand Professor Mohanty's concern that this is a word so much used by the mainstream. We shouldn't let them monopolize the meaning of this word. But then for me, I feel that while I would also agree that we should not let the elite and the criminals monopolize the meanings of words like freedom, democracy, and development and progress. We need to give a different meaning, and we need to give a different terminology so that we would be showing how criminal it has been and how oppressed the people have been, and how we still cling to hope and cling to action to try to change the reality. And I think I remember Gustavo said, what is hope? Hope is that we still have the imagination, that we can name the unbearable, we can name the intolerable, and by naming it, we look at it, and then we can still find our ways of dealing with it. And I think the question from the Chinese audience about hope, I think the best answer is to look at how the people in Chiapas had been oppressed, had been put under genocide through poverty, through impoverishment, despite the fact that Chiapas is such a place, it's a place so rich with so-called natural resources, so rich with its herbs, with the waters, with what nature would be giving to the people, and yet they are what has been plundered from them. So if we look at this example of the Zapatista rebellion, we see how the people out of desperation say enough is enough. So we are going to foster and nourish our own way of life. And I think Victor just now also beautifully put forth the terms that have been used by different indigenous communities on good living. So with that, then I think if we can see all the pains and sufferings that Elias mentioned, if we see all the collapses, but we will also at the same time be able to see the spirit of defiance and the spirit of rebellion that are there among the people, that continue to say we will survive, we will live, we will try to network and also build solidarities with others. And that is why I think the idea of friendship and hospitality are so important. And of course, Gustavo himself actually practiced this friendship with his generosity, and which is why I think so many of us remember him with such fondness. So on the question, I think I would like to, well, just now, David talked about the Milpa, which is so beautiful. And you talked about the 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, when we have to see the network of the underground roots. So now I would like to bring you to look at the sky. Today, it happens to be the 7th day of the 7th month in the lunar calendar. And this is celebrated as the Tanabata festival in Japan, as the Stars Fest, as the Lovers Festival in China. We have a very beautiful legend. The legend was that about 3,000 years ago, that was the time of the Western Zhao dynasty. And the people were so oppressed that life was so difficult that they invented this festival on the 7th day of the 7th month. And the legend was that there is this star of the cowherd, there's the star of the weaver, and this boy and this girl, these lovers, they are separated from each other all days in the year, except on this particular night. Then the magpies would go there and build a bridge and so in the Milky Way, so that the two can join each other. And so it is a romantic story, but then it is also a very sad story, because it's only one day every year that they can meet. And yet this expressed the imagination and the hope of the people under oppression. But of course, throughout these 3,000 years, it has changed, the meaning has changed. And today people remember this as the Lovers' Day, that the two lovers, forced by circumstances, forced by external forces, they couldn't be together, they couldn't hold their hands. But then on this particular day, they could embrace each other. And so I feel that this also speaks for our hope, that despite all the sufferings, we can still see that at least one day in the year, we can be embracing each other with love and with hope. So thank you all very much.